Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. It's time for another biology lecture. So, this one is about senses and perception. This is part one of two. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the five senses: smell, sight, hearing, taste, touch, and we're going to learn how they work. So, a sensory system is just a pathway from sensory receptors to the brain. And inside the brain, the signals from these receptors can be sensed and perceived by different parts of the brain that are specialized for receiving those signals. Or maybe that was confusing, but if you look at this picture on the right, you can see a bald person, and you can see inside of their face, and you see different sensory systems. So here's one, the eye. So it begins with the eye. So there's a stimulus that comes in, which would be light. It hits the eye, the stimulus gets received by the eye, and then the eye sends a nervous signal, called an action potential, to parts of the brain that then create the image, including the colors that you're seeing. Another sensory system would be the olfactory system, which is just fancy talk for smell. So molecules would get snorted up your nose. They'd interact with your nose. Your nose would then send nervous signals to the brain, and your brain is going to establish a smell or perceive a smell. All right, so these sensory systems all begin with a stimulus. And a stimulus is anything that activates a sensory receptor. So a stimulus could be light waves that are absorbed through your eye, or it could be a sound wave that hits your ear, or it could be you touch a hot stove, or it could be you smell a flower. Those are all different stimuli that are going to stimulate one of those sensory pathways. And so in this silly picture I pulled off of Google Images, here's the stimulus. So there's light shining on a glass of water. Some of that light hits the eye, hits receptors in the eye, sends a sensation to the brain. The brain processes that information, and then your brain can do things like send a signal through nerves to the muscles of your arm, like we talked about in a previous lecture actually, causing your muscles to contract, and then you splash the water in your face. So all of these sensory pathways begin with a stimulus. When we receive a stimulus, there's a couple of steps that happen. So a stimulus becomes transduced, which creates a sensation, which is then perceived by the brain. Okay, so just look at the picture. The stimulation is light waves that are bouncing off of this butterfly. So the light waves once again hit the eye. In the eye, those light waves, look, the light waves don't pass to your brain, right? That'd be weird. Instead, the light waves trigger photoreceptors, certain cells in the back of your eye that can absorb light waves, and those cells transduce those light waves into a nervous signal or a neural signal, which travels along nerves up your spinal, or not to your up your spinal cord, travels along nerves that link your eye to your brain, and those nervous signals pass along your brain. So you sense it, so you sense that there's light, there's something there, and then you perceive it. So in other words, your brain puts together those light waves, the colors, the patterns, the movement, and produces the image of a butterfly in your head. So all four steps are necessary. You need stimulation, so there's got to be some source of stimulus. It's got to be transduced, so it's got to hit your eye in order for you to know that it's there. You have to sense it, so your brain has to receive those nervous signals and begin to put them into an image, and then you have to perceive it. So your brain has to put those sensations together to create the image of a butterfly. So what are some cells that receive stimuli? Right? Cells that receive stimuli are called sensory receptors, and we can put them into different categories. Photoreceptors detect light waves. Where would you find photoreceptors? Kids? Young adults? Adults that are watching? Photoreceptors would be found in your eyeballs. Osmoreceptors detect solute levels in bodily fluids. So blood sugar level, water level. If osmoreceptors say, hey, we're running low on water, then it might send a signal to your brain. Your brain's going to tell you that it's going to create a sensation of thirst, for example. Where would you find osmoreceptors? Well, mostly in your body. Mechanoreceptors detect movement. Where are you going to find these? In your muscles and in your skin. So mechanoreceptors are going to send signals to your brain letting you know where your limbs are and what they're doing. Thermoreceptors detect heat and cold, so you'll find a lot of these in your skin. In this picture, you can see there are specialized nerves. Some of them are specialized for detecting heat, some are specialized for detecting cold. Regardless, both of those would be classified as thermoreceptors. Chemoreceptors detect chemicals. Where would you find chemoreceptors? You'd find them on your tongue, because when you eat food, you're basically ingesting chemicals, and those chemicals are going to interact with the chemoreceptors on your tongue and send a signal to your brain, which is going to interpret those chemicals as various flavors. You also have chemoreceptors in your nose. Pain receptors detect tissue damage, so you're going to find these all over your body, which is a good thing, because if something breaks or gets injured, you want to know about it. And so pain receptors just say, hey, there's something wrong here, there's damage, and your brain interprets that or perceives that as pain. Some parts of your body have lots of pain receptors, so we would say they're sensitive, like your fingertip or your lip. If you injure those, it hurts really bad. Other places, you're not going to detect as much pain because there's not as many pain receptors. Okay, so those different receptors are all involved with the five senses, and the five senses are all really happening in the brain. So those receptors that we just saw are just collecting data from the environment, whether it's chemicals or sound waves or light waves, and then they're sending those, or they're transducing those signals into nervous signals, which pass along your spinal cord and your nerves and end up in your brain, where you perceive smell, sight, sound, touch, and taste. So we can differentiate between sensation and perception. So sensation is what comes into our body through those sensory systems. And then perception is what our brain does with it. So again, the sensation that our eye is going to detect is light waves, and the perception that our brain is going to produce is the image of a butterfly. So here it is again, basically the same definitions, but I don't know why I have this on here twice. So you've got different receptors that are going to sense outside stimuli, and they're going to be in different places on your body. So I mentioned that in your skin you'll have thermoreceptors that are going to detect warm and cold. So you're going to find those on the skin on your hands, for example. So if you grab an ice cube, you're going to perceive that it's cold, and that's because those thermoreceptors are interacting with the cold ice cube and are sending a signal to your brain. So we put photoreceptors in our eyes, so we have to detect light through our eyes. But interestingly, other animals can put photoreceptors like on their skin or whatever, and so then they'd be able to see with their skin. Or maybe you've heard of how caterpillars and butterflies can taste with their feet. All you got to do is put some chemoreceptors on your feet instead of on your tongue, and voila, you can taste stuff with your toes. All right, and this graphic here is showing what I've been repeating like every 5 seconds. You get a stimulus that comes in, you sense it, so it travels to your brain and it senses that stimuli that the receptors are sending, and then it perceives it, so it creates an image. So each of the 5 senses is receiving different types of information. So taste is basically just chemoreceptors on your tongue interacting with molecules. This is a sugar molecule, and that came from a donut you just ate. Your ears are interacting with sound waves, and so the sound waves are coming from this old school record player. There's probably a more specific name for that, but I can't think of it. All I can think of is xylophone. That's not right. What is this thing? Your eyes interact with a certain type of data from the photoreceptors in your eyes. They're dealing with light waves that are of a specific wavelength in the visible spectrum. Your nose is interacting with molecules, and these molecules are floating off of this rose, and then you're sniffing them. Touch is interacting with physical substances or physical structures. And so the various textures and patterns are creating a sensation in your fingers, which your brain perceives as touch. We'll talk about each of these in turn in order to learn how they work. Pain is another type of sensation, and it's basically like, I actually already mentioned this a minute ago, it's the sensation and perception of tissue injury. So there's special receptors that detect injury and send a signal to your brain, and then your brain says, ow, that hurts. What's interesting is all perceptions can be modified by drugs and psychological states. So pain perception can be modified by drugs. And the way that these drugs work is they basically mess with the signal that's being sent to the brain, so they can affect the way that we're perceiving pain. So you step on a nail and it hurts on the bottom of your foot, so you take a couple of ibuprofen, and before you know it, it doesn't hurt as bad. So the ibuprofen is interacting with your brain in a way that's basically turning down the dial on the perception of pain. Your nerves are still sending a signal, hey, there's a nail in my foot, but your brain is kind of able to ignore it with the help of the drugs. So what's really interesting is this means that all perceptions, and we're using pain as an example here, but all perceptions can be modified by your mental state. So there's an interesting study, and I linked to it in the PowerPoint here, where a physician at Harvard during World War II basically would interview soldiers that had been injured and ask them to rank, basically say, hey, how much pain are you feeling? It's where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And he would compare those ratings of pain with just people that came into a hospital that got injured. So let's say a soldier got shot in the shoulder, and then let's say that someone walking down the street got mugged and they got shot in the shoulder. What he found was that soldiers would report much lower pain ratings. So they would experience little or sometimes even no pain. So what's up with that? So this study and others suggest that the perception of pain depends on your context. So if a soldier gets injured, say the soldier gets shot in the shoulder, they get hauled off to the hospital, and for them, they're going to be thinking, you know what, I got shot, but I'm still alive. This is great. And in fact, now I'm not going to be on the front line anymore. I'm going to be in this hospital recuperating for a while. Maybe I'll get some leave and get to go home and see my family. And so for that soldier, they don't perceive the pain to be that bad because the pain is mitigated by those good thoughts. On the other hand, the person that got mugged, they got shot, and they're going to lay there and they might be thinking, wow, this really hurts. And you know what? I got shot, and why did that person mug me? I wasn't expecting to get mugged or shot today. And now that I'm shot, I might lose my job. Or what if it gets infected? How am I going to pay for these hospital bills? So their psychological context is going to be different, and so they're going to perceive pain in a different way. So that's true for all of the different senses that we're talking about today. All right, let's talk about the 5 senses. So first up is vision. How does vision work? Well, vision works through your eyes, right? And your eyes have to be connected to your brain. Otherwise, it's not going to work real well. So how does that work? Well, your eyes have photoreceptors in them. I've mentioned that a couple of times. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And these photoreceptors in your eye absorb different wavelengths of light and then send a signal to your brain, and your brain senses those signals and then perceives whatever you're looking at. Right? Our eyes are pretty good. We have fairly complex eyes, and so we can see a high resolution world. Right? You're reading the words on the screen right now. That's good, and that's because you can see them and you can differentiate between the different letters on the screen in the words of the sentences. If you were a snail, you probably couldn't read, not only because snails don't know how to read, but because snails just simply don't see the world the same way that we do. A tree wouldn't be able to read at all because a tree doesn't have eyes. So trees don't have photoreceptors that are going to send a signal to the brain and create an image of their outside world. So trees can respond and sense light, but they're not going to create, as far as we know, they're not going to create a visual image and see the squirrel crawling on their branches or see a hawk circling overhead. All right, so I mentioned photoreceptors. The cells in the back of the eye here, these are photoreceptors, and again, they absorb wavelengths of light, or photons that have different wavelengths of light, and then they send a nervous signal along the optic nerve to the brain. Right? And so that's required for perception to occur. So let's spend a little bit of time just talking about how the eye is put together. So a couple of things, and I'll go quickly here. Let me just go to this one. I scratched out some of the stuff we're skipping. So light's going to come in over here, so it's going to move from left to right. And so the eye is first going to pass through the cornea. So the cornea is a transparent layer of cells that basically protects your eyes. It's kind of like the windshield of your eye. The light is then going to go through this. This is the aqueous humor. And the aqueous humor, it basically helps keep the lens moist. So it helps, it's really interacting with the lens below it and helping to keep it healthy. So what's the lens? Here's the lens. So the lens is going to absorb light, and then it kind of separates that light out. So it organizes it and focuses it. And so the lens is required in order for you to see light, to see light with any acuity. How much light is hitting the lens is going to be controlled by the iris and the pupil. So the pupil is the opening through which light passes, and the pupil can become larger or smaller based on the actions of the iris. So the iris can widen and create a larger pupil and let more light in. So that might happen at nighttime, for example, when there's not much light to go around. Or if you're in bright light, the iris might constrict and let less light through because it's made the pupil smaller. So we can control how much light is entering the eye. The light, after it passes through the lens, it passes through this, the vitreous body, basically just a bunch of fluid that helps kind of organize the light waves. And then the light waves are going to come back here, and they're going to hit photoreceptors on this yellow layer of the eye. This is called the retina. So the retina is packed full of photoreceptors. While the retina goes all around your eye, the part that is really responsible for creating a clear vision or clear image is called the fovea. So the point here is when the light comes in through the eye, you'd like to focus it ideally on the fovea, because the fovea is like the most precise section of the retina. And if the light hits the fovea, then it's going to be able to send a signal along this, the optic nerve, to the brain and allow you to see a clear image. The photoreceptors that are in the retina come in two types. They're either rod cells or cone cells, and so your retina has a mixture of these. Most of the photoreceptors in the retina are called rod cells, and they work really well when there's not a lot of light, right? And here's a picture of one. So it's kind of this long thing. So light's going to come in moving right to left, and the photon's going to go through here, and it's going to stimulate this rod cell, and then it's going to send a signal along nerves to the brain. All right, so rod cells are going to be able to detect light, but they're not really good for color. You're going to use rod cells when you're looking, at something at dusk or at nighttime or when the lights are turned off. So it's better for the presence or absence of light, but it's not really good at achieving a clear vision or looking at colors. So you're not going to look at a painting in the dark. You're just not going to see much, and that's because you're mostly going to see it through rod cells. Cone cells, so-called because this part it looks more like a cone, these are photoreceptors that are active in bright light. So you use these in daytime vision or when you're looking at a computer screen, and these are better for generating color and for seeing things really sharply. The cone cells come in different types, so they're sensitive to different wavelengths, so red or blue or green, and the combinations of how these cone cells are being stimulated is going to create all the different color patterns that you perceive in your brain. Here it is again. So here we've got light coming in. All of this would be the retina, and the light waves come in. You can see that there's rods and cones, and the light waves are going to interact with them. You can see that there's more rods than there are cones, and you also, it's kind of weird, you're going to see that they're oriented backwards. So the light actually comes in on the wrong side, I won't talk about why that is, but they're kind of facing the wrong way. But that's okay, they work just fine. So the light waves hit the photoreceptors, they send a signal that goes to the brain, and the brain perceives it. And what's interesting is your right eye is hooked up to the left hemisphere of your brain, and your left eye is hooked up to the right hemisphere of your brain. So the two halves of your brain actually process what you see, and they process it in slightly different ways, which I'm not going to get into here, but it's pretty weird. Another weird thing is, based on the optics of how light comes into our eye, your eye actually sends your visual images to the brain upside down. Right? And you're like, what are you talking about? I'm back. I'm seeing the world. It's not upside down. Well, actually, you are seeing the world upside down. It's just that your brain is flipping it. So you're seeing the world upside down right now, but your brain is presenting an image that's flipped right side up. Right? So your brain probably had to learn to do this. We don't really know how babies see the world because they can't read or write, which is really annoying. But newborn babies probably see the world upside down, and then after a few days or weeks, they're like, wait a minute, all this stuff is wrong, this is upside down, and so the brain flips it. There's an interesting experiment that you can do where you can buy some goggles that you wear, and the goggles flip the world upside down, and after wearing them for, I forget, a few days, hours to days, that upside down image gets flipped by your brain and you start seeing the world correctly. Then if you take those upside down goggles off, you start seeing the world upside down again, and then your brain flips it right side up again. So the point is, your brain is, and we're going to see more of this in the next video, but your brain is filtering and editing the world to allow for better perception. Okay, your eye undergoes visual accommodation, which means that there are muscles in your eye that adjust the shape of the lens or the diameter of your pupil in order to help focus light precisely on your retina and especially the fovea. And so the lens that I mentioned before, I told you the lens is responsible for focusing the light waves, the photons, and the lens can be modified. There's these little muscles that can pull on it, and the muscles can relax and make the lens fat, or they can contract and make the lens thin. Why is this? This is to allow you to focus. So if it's a skinny and flat lens, then that's good for seeing things that are far away. But if you're reading or looking at something up close, did I say skinny fat? Sorry, let me start over. If you're looking at something far away, you want the muscles to pull on your lens so it's skinny, and that's going to help focus the light waves more accurately. And if you're reading and are looking at something up close, then you want a fat lens, and that's going to help the light waves be more focused. So in other words, if you're looking at something far away versus looking at something close, your eyes have to adjust and have to adjust the shape of the lens. Some of us have eyes that do this really well. So if you've got 20/20 vision, congratulations. Your lens can adapt to looking at things far away and up close, and you don't perceive much of a difference. But some of you guys have a misshapen eyeball, right? Or you've got a worn out lens. And so the point is, if you have a misshapen eyeball, what can happen is when you look at something up close, hold up, I'm getting ahead of myself. So just pause. Man, I'm blowing this. If you look at something up close, then your lens is going to adjust, and you want the image right here on the fovea. This will allow you to see whatever you're looking at up close with high resolution. If you're looking at something far away, the lens relaxes, and again, it's going to relax and allow the image to be projected right here on your fovea. But if you have a misshapen eyeball, here you're looking at something far away, and your eyeball is too wide, and so the focal point is right here when it should be right here on the fovea. So in this case, this shape of eyeball will lead to a condition called nearsightedness. So here you can't, when you look at something far away, it seems to be blurry, and it's because your eye isn't projecting the image in the right location. In farsightedness, it's the same thing, just the opposite. So here your eyeball is too skinny, So when you look at something up close, like you're trying to read, your eyeball projects the image at a place that's not on your fovea, and so whatever you're reading is going to be blurry. So how do we fix this? Well, we wear glasses. So glasses basically just start bending the light appropriately and help us focus the image in the right spot so we have clear vision. And eye problems tend to get worse with age, and some of that is because the lens loses its flexibility. So I mentioned muscles pull on the lens to change its shape, and as we get older, the lens just gets less elastic, and so we just can't adjust as well. So vision tends to decline with age because of that. That's why your grandparents wear glasses. There's also some problems that can happen in the eyes. So color blindness is a genetic X-linked recessive problem. And because it's X-linked, it's more pronounced in males. And here there's a problem with their photoreceptors, and so they can't see some red and green light waves, and so they have reduced color spectrum detection. There's other age-related disorders. Macular degeneration is when the photoreceptors in the fovea break down. And remember, the fovea is where you see, that's what the fovea is responsible for detecting light from whatever you're looking at. So if the fovea breaks down, when you look at something, you're going to end up seeing like this big blurry spot right in the middle of your vision. Glaucoma is when the aqueous humor, let's go back, this fluid in your eye. So when the aqueous humor has too much pressure in it, then it builds up, and basically you have it feels like your eyeballs are about to burst. Well, I don't know if it feels like that or not, but basically your eyeballs are full of fluid, and that interferes with vision. Cataracts are when your lens clouds, and basically because your lens is clouded, it's kind of like everything seems out of focus. All right, so to conclude vision, when we perceive the different things that we look at, it's interesting to know that the light waves that are hitting your eye actually exist, but the colors and the colors that you see are not real. In other words, the colors that you see don't exist out in the physical world. They only exist in your brain. So the colors that you're looking at right now on this rainbow, they're being produced by your brain, and in reality, they're just simply different light waves that are being produced by your computer screen. Let's talk about touch. So touch works by you touch something and it stimulates nerves in your skin, and those nerves send signals to your brain, and you perceive it as hot or cold or rough or smooth or whatever. So it interacts with, it's generated by stimuli interacting with nerves that are in your skin. What's interesting is your brain has different areas that are connected to these touch receptors throughout your skin, but your brain doesn't treat all areas equally. In other words, there are parts of your brain that are responsible for interpreting touch sensations from your tongue or from your lips or from your elbow or from your toes, and some of these are bigger, or there's more parts of the brain assigned to them. So in other words, your lips are really sensitive because there's a big section of your brain that's paying attention to what your lips are sensing. All right, so in this freaky picture, you can see that our hands and our feet and our lips and our tongue simply have more parts of the brain subscribed to those nerves. And so if you get a paper cut on your finger, or you bite your tongue or bite your lip, it hurts really badly. And again, that's because your brain is just more attuned to those signals from the nerves in those parts of your body. If you get a scratch on your back, it doesn't hurt as bad because there's not as many parts of the brain attuned to the nerves that are on your back. Your brain also filters the information that it's getting from these nerves. So your brain is paying attention to how many nerves are communicating and which nerves are firing. So if your eyes are stimulated and they send a signal to your brain's going to interpret that as light. All right, so that means if you take your thumbs and push on your eyes really hard, you rub your eyes, when you open your eyes, you might see flashes of color. And that's because you've stimulated the receptors in your eye through pressure, through touch, and your brain is like, well, the eye is communicating, so it must be light. So you see light that doesn't actually exist. The frequency of nervous signals and the number of nerves involved also has an influence. So if you get a teeny little, poke on your finger, that's not very many nerves that are being affected, and they might not send a very strong signal, and so your brain might not even perceive that something touched you on your, finger. If somebody was to hit your finger with a hatchet, that's going to be lots of signals from the nerves, lots of nerves are going to be involved, and your brain is definitely going to pay attention. All right, so there's kind of a threshold. There's a threshold at which we start to perceive touch, and then the higher we go above that threshold, then the more attention we're going to give that stimulus. There's also something called sensory adaptation. So again, your brain is filtering your touch information, and sometimes it turns the dial up, and sometimes it turns the dial down. So what I mean by that is, if you put your glasses on, or you were to put a hat on, or you put your socks on, you might initially feel it. So put your hat on your head, and your brain is like, yeah, I feel the hat. It feels good, not too tight, not too loose. But after about 10 minutes or so, you might forget that you're even wearing a hat, right? And maybe you've like me, you've put your glasses on, and after a couple hours, you're like, hey, where are my glasses? So in other words, you forget that you're even wearing them. And the reason for this is your brain doesn't need to listen to these nerves on your ears that are saying, hey, I'm wearing glasses, I'm wearing glasses, I'm wearing glasses. After a while, your brain's like, okay, I get it. I'm wearing glasses. Let's just turn down the dial, and I'm going to start ignoring those nerves. So again, your brain is kind of filtering the sensory input that it's getting from these different sensory systems, and it can even, start ignoring some of the signals. So this means that there are physical surfaces that we touch that are real. They might have different temperatures, or they might have different textures, but what you're feeling is generated by your brain. So in other words, when you touch a hot stove, the high temperature is real, but that sensation of hot, or that sensation of burning, is generated by the perceptions of your brain. How about smell and taste? Right? And they're similar. Smell and taste are very similar because they're interacting with chemicals. You'll see that in a minute. Smell is called olfaction. So olfaction is the sense of smell. You have olfactory receptors that are in your nasal passages up here. And so what happens is you sniff some air. So basically you're inhaling some molecules that are floating around in the air. Some of those molecules come up and bump into the osmoreceptors inside your nose. And when those molecules bind with certain receptors, they send a signal up to your brain, and your brain is like, I smell pizza. We have about 5 million of these olfactory receptors in our nose. A bloodhound, which is a dog, has 200 million. So the number of osmoreceptors is going to affect the sense of smell. The more receptors that there are, then the more acute the sense of smell. These osmoreceptors also interact with airborne chemicals like pheromones. And what's interesting is you might not smell these, but these pheromones can go and interact, and then it sends a signal to your brain, and your brain, instead of perceiving it as a smell, will be like, oh, there's a signal coming from this molecule, and so it might trigger physiological changes. A good example of that is bees. So the queen bee releases these pheromone chemicals. They float on the air. They interact with other bees, and then the bees, the way that they develop, or the way that they act, is influenced by those pheromones. So our behavior can actually be influenced by chemicals. All right, and then taste is similar to olfaction. In taste, we have chemoreceptors that are very similar to, or basically the same as olfactory receptors, except they're on the tongue. All right, so we'd call these taste buds. So what happens is you take a drink of orange juice or bite into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and the chemicals that are in there land on your tongue and interact with your taste buds, Your taste buds then send a signal to your brain, and your brain perceives different tastes. Right? Our taste buds all happen to be on our tongue. That's why if you want to taste something, you're going to eat it or lick it. But if you were to touch it with your hand, you don't know what it tastes like. Butterflies and other insects can taste their food with their feet, and that's just because they have the equivalent of taste buds on their feet. The taste buds come in 5 different types. So basically, in other words, there's like 5 different taste sensations. And those 5 sensations are sweet, salty, sour, and bitter, and umami. Umami, not it's easily confused with your mommy, but it's umami. This is like rich taste. Like I put aged cheese on here, and the picture shows soy sauce and Parmesan. So it's like I'm going blank, like rich, earthy, complex flavors. So everything that you can taste is a combination of these 5 different taste types firing. So when you bite into a slice of pizza, you're tasting maybe some saltiness that was in the dough. You're tasting umami in the pepperoni. Maybe you're tasting some sweetness in the tomato sauce, etc., etc. So every flavor that you get is these firing in different combinations. Pretty cool. So your sense of smell and your sense of taste are really similar because they're both interacting with chemicals. So your tongue is just interacting with chemicals usually that are in a solid substance like a pepperoni, or in liquid like a sip of coffee, whereas the olfactory receptors in your nose are interacting with airborne chemicals that are floating around in the air. But they're linked. So if you ever had a cold and you get stuffy in your nose, you don't have a good sense of smell, and you'll see that that affects your sense of taste. So our sense of taste and smell are kind of linked, and they're processed by similar sections in the brain. So the perception of taste, much like our perception of vision, is an interaction with the stimulus. So when we taste a donut, we're really just interacting with particular chemicals that send a signal to our brain via our tongue, and we perceive the taste of Krispy Kreme. In the sense of smell, the rose is giving off certain airborne chemicals which go into our nose and interact with olfactory receptors, which we perceive as the smell of the flower. So the molecules are real, they actually exist, but the taste of a donut or the smell of a rose, those only exist inside your brain. All right, next video we'll pick up and cover the rest of the senses, and then I've got some cool mind-blowing slides to show you, as if this wasn't mind-blowing enough. Yeah, but stay tuned.